Hello, it's Peter Merrick, and I'm so excited. I'm speaking to a fellow Canadian, Cynthia Chung of the Rising Tide Foundation. She has a Substack that you are going to see written over here, over our heads, that you have to check out. She's asking questions that an informed citizen should be asking. And it's three things that we have to look at. And I always look at this. If you want to know where you are and where you're going, you have to know where you've come from. And Cynthia has organized in her writing and in her speaking the history we were not taught. And it's important to know our history because many of us over the last 3 years have seen a glitch in the matrix. Behind me, I have a picture of our capital, Ottawa, and I was completely sad that my country had been lost. And then a spark happened, and it showed that it had life. And we have life, and to know that we have life, we also have to have knowledge to become wisdom, and that wisdom will become action. Cynthia, please share with me a little about your story. I'm so excited. I spent maybe 24 hours in the last little while in preparation for our talk, listening to you, maybe even more than Matt has. And I just want to share with people, Matt Ehret is the president of Canadian Patriot. We've had several discussions and he's been so generous with his time with me. You should also check out Matt because the two of them are a power couple when it comes to educating those who want to know, who need to take action and be educated in the steps that they take. Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thank you for having me on. Yeah, so to just introduce a little bit of myself, like you said, I'm the president of the Rising Tide Foundation. And basically, before 2019, I was more focused on a kind of cultural and historical, dialogue literature. I did lectures on those sorts of things. But by 2019, I became increasingly more political in my writing. But that's the nice thing too, like when you study a lot of like the really good artists who wrote dramas and so forth, they were more often than not political themselves, right? And they were writing these pieces to intervene on their time where, we're always having some kind of struggle with the period that we're living in. And so I very much feel that background is what has shaped my political approach in my writing and my historical overview, which I tend to focus on geopolitical and counterintelligence, cultural warfare type subjects. And it was really a great opportunity for me to start this because I myself thinking of, what can I possibly share with whoever, ends up reading this, insights into the situation so that we can actually have a little bit more self-empowerment and understanding. Because as soon as you understand the kind of villainy, for a general term to describe what we're confronting today, it becomes a lot less intimidating, a lot less, a lot of people almost think of it as a supernatural thing. When you can actually trace it and identify it, it becomes a lot more clear and also more easily recognizable when you confront it in its various forms today. And I think that that's one of the big problems that we have as a crisis, is one of them being that we don't have a historical understanding anymore, as you mentioned. But another one is that we are becoming divided into a lot of groups that end up, oftentimes disagreeing. So, we'll have a group that realizes that there's something wrong, but then within that group, we have all these subdivisions of people who are disagreeing with each other exactly what is wrong with what's happening and what are the solutions. So I like to do a historical overview because it's a lot easier to prove more concretely what was the problem in those situations. And as you make all of these various studies throughout the centuries, you realize that the pattern is the same. And then you can use that to start studying the present in a way where we don't have as much, of like our emotional blinders on, certain kinds of baggage, which is played off of. And that's, exactly, for instance, the tactic with color revolutions is to oftentimes, it's not like a made up problem that causes these types of things to occur, but they basically light something on fire that was already, something that was explosive to begin with. So we have to be, aware of these kinds of vulnerabilities, so to speak, and not allow ourselves to be emotionally manipulated in these situations. And that's why, especially with the Ukraine war that began last year, or not last year, it's actually this year still, but it's almost last year. I started to do a series on a historical overview, basically, of like just trying to see like why are we, in this situation today where it's increasingly, it seems impossible to have a dialogue, and who's really responsible for that failure in not having a dialogue. And right before that, I had already done like the Huxley series as well, which was oddly, it overlaps quite a bit, the cultural warfare aspect of what we've been put through in the West, the MK Ultra program, all of this has actually its roots in the same things. And so doing this work, I ended up having enough to basically put out a book that I've recently launched called The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. And that's volume 1 of what will be 2 volumes. So this volume is focusing more on the birth of fascism in the 20th century and how we never defeated the fascists in World War II, but basically it became a more underground form of warfare that was psychological and cultural. And now increasingly, as you see, it's becoming a scientific dictatorship, but that was something that was very openly being discussed in the 1930s and even earlier. But, the 1930s is when people started to really have a lot of talk about this of fascism and scientific fascism. And, at the time, people didn't have the same reaction to the word fascism as they do today. There was a lot of circles that were talking about this in a positive way, including within the United States, to the point that it really, a lot of the leading organizers, I guess you could say, of governments and institutions thought that fascism was going to be a shoo-in, that World War II was supposed to be a world revolution for a fascist takeover. And we had a lot of institutions within the United States, within Britain, which I focus on in my book in great detail, that were for this. And it was defeated not because of resistance really from France or Britain. It was defeated because of Roosevelt within the United States as president. He had a lot of pushback, though, to get involved. And the Soviet Union, which took the brunt of the German army. And if you look at all of the other countries that Germany had entered into, like all of these countries had crumbled within 2 weeks. So it really was that particular resistance from Roosevelt and Stalin that stopped that fascist takeover. But the thing is that Roosevelt, first of all, he died before the end of the war. He died 2 weeks before the first United Nations conference. And there was basically a takeover at that point. The United Nations was supposed to be something very different. And because he was dead 2 weeks prior, they changed it into the League of Nations concept. And the League of Nations concept is what we are living in today. And it's basically a view that for a new world order, because, you know, at the end of World War I, you had all of the empires basically had collapsed at that point, and you basically had a lot of formations of republics. And so the League of Nations concept was pretty much to reinstitutionalize empire. And there were basically 6 regions that were supposed to oversee empire, but Britain was supposed to be the top dog overseer in this. And basically, it was an imperial fascist viewpoint of how to segregate the world. And it had a lot of blood and soil ideology in it, that, you know, you shouldn't be living in a country that you are not ethnically, you know, connected to. And these 6 regions covered the United States, Britain, basically an Austro-Hungary empire to revive that, Russia, China, and Japan. And that the plan for Africa and Arabia would be basically enslavement. And, you know, fascists like Oswald Mosley of Britain, which people might know from Peaky Blinders, the idea was, he made it very clear that the League of Nations concept was to basically have Africa as the labor core for all of Europe. And then, you know, Oswald Mosley has also been very clear in writing about how H.G. Wells's scientific fascism was a model that he thought was, you know, exactly what we should be pursuing in the future. And H.G. Wells is what has also influenced Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Bertrand Russell's scientific outlook is also something that has influenced Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was not a warning. It was basically a blueprint. And Bertrand Russell also fits very heavily into this storyline. But this is something that has been planned out for a very long time, tied to eugenics as well. And this idea that some are born to rule and some are born to be ruled. And knowing this, it might seem, I guess, really daunting to people, and we can maybe go into some details, because I'm just kind of doing a broad sweep right now. But knowing this, I think it makes it easier to confront the huge amount of misinformation that's going on right now, because one of the tragedies in history are the missed opportunities. When you have an ally that is actually available to you, but you don't realize it at the time because you're getting blinded by all of this stuff coming in, that you just become increasingly more paranoid and distrustful of everything. So by understanding that the problems that we're seeing here in the West, they're not from a foreign entity. They can be traced back, you know, even further than the 20th century, but the 20th century, the brand that we see is very much traceable to specific characters, you know, and Churchill was also involved in this, Kalergi was involved in this, that it was all planned out that way. So this constant blame, right, of like a foreign interference, which is something that we've been hearing for like pretty much all of the 20th century. It's always being blamed on something else. The issue is that we have an internal problem that is so bad at this point. We need like a complete system overhaul, because our financial structure, you know, based on Wall Street and City of London, Geneva, this is at the very core of this. It's not, you know, enough to go after a few names and everything, but we have to realize what are the problems within the system that has allowed for this continual removal of civil liberties and lack of respect for civil liberties, and how we can return to a system that can respect that. And there's a lot actually in American history, not so much in Canadian history, But there's a lot in American history that people can learn from. The solutions are already there. The United States was the first country to ever resist such a colossal empire. And they did it through their economic discoveries, which made them the most powerful country in the world 100 years later, not militarily, right? But they were a productive country. They were innovators in the sciences at that point. And you had the Centennial Exhibition that Henry C. Carey had organized. And there was, I think, about 27 million people from about over 30 countries who came to see what the United States had accomplished within a short period of time and how they were able to do this. And a lot of countries were being organized by the United States during this period of how to develop economically so that you could have national sovereignty. And that has been always the things that have been budding. It's like, are you going to have an imperial system like a League of Nations world empire? Again, very much like Aldous Huxley's Mustafa Mons type world, you have like, so many controllers, the sort of idea, or are you going to have countries that can participate economically with each other to mutual benefit and not fit into this zero-sum game, which is a lie. This is a belief to justify empire. If you think that we do live in a zero-sum game world, it means then that you can't argue that empire is necessary and that empire is required for stability of resources and so forth. So the Americans are lucky in a sense because their history actually has the solutions that they need. And when people are centered again in the true spirit of that, what made the United States a beacon of liberty and freedom for the whole world. The Statue of Liberty used to mean something before it was taken over basically by British imperial policy after World War II, which is another thing I go through in the book.
And I just want to focus on a few things before we start moving into your book and the lessons that you discovered through your own journey. And I think one of the reasons why we like the books that we like is someone gives a lexicon to what we know. And that's why we're attracted to it. Now, I had a big paradigm crack that happened to me over the last 3 years. And I wrote an article. And it was, why do I believe what I believe? And I thought about it and I said, well, I just trust because everything's good. It's only when things are not so good, you have to step back and you have to look at your life. And I came up with 5 reasons why I didn't question everything. And just questioning everything is important. And the first one was, I just bowed to authority. My parents believed it. People on the news talked about it. I was just a sponge. I just showed up like everyone else. It's like that movie 50 Dates. Like by the time you actually get some intelligence, it's time to go to bed. We're all Sisyphus, where we push up the rock, but by the time we actually get it up there, it's time for us to leave. Now someone else has to push it up, and hopefully it doesn't roll back to the bottom where we're starting from scratch. So I trusted authority. Number 2, I was just too busy. I was just too busy to even look around. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have children. I wanted what I thought I wanted was like status, money, a good life. Number 3, I was just too lazy to ask the question. Number 4, I was too stupid to phrase the question. And the last one, I believe, is just as powerful as number 1, where I just didn't question authority, because why would I distrust these people? These were people who I thought had my interests at heart, and most of them did. They were my family. I was too frightened to be ostracized for asking the question that would make people feel uncomfortable, because we're social beings. One of the things that I got from looking at all your material is that there has to be some type of evil force in the world. I didn't believe this before. And people could call it the devil, Satan, or whatever, but there's certain people who are attracted to Lucifer, the light bearer, and it's sort of like a moth. And that's exactly the image I want everyone to think about these people who are running and telling us what we should be doing. Justin Trudeau, Klaus Schwab. You can just name all these people. I even will throw in Elon Musk, because if you do your searching, you have a lot of questions about him. You also have a lot of questions about Trump. You have to start asking questions, not just trusting what we're told, because the victors write the history. And there's been a big crack in the matrix. And I have to share something with you, Cynthia. Listening to your history about the Huxleys, I'm going to move this is going to bridge into your book. In my last book, I focused on aging and mentorship and initiation, something that doesn't exist in our society anymore. And there must have been utility for it, because if they were backward societies, why would they put so much energy to initiate their young people and also their old people to become elders? So I gave a message to myself, and this you were mentioning about your book and people finding value in it. I tell the story of Melville and Moby Dick. And Melville in his life never, ever saw the popularity of his book. It was 72 years until people knew the book existed. It went flat. And he had already been dead 32 years before it went flat. Now, listening to your stuff on Huxley, you blew me out of the water when you started talking all the people he was associated with. It was D.H. Lawrence who drew attention to Moby Dick. And all these people, they all seem to have a hand in the world we live in today. So that being said, your book has value, and people will find that value and be educated. So let's focus on the core tenets of your current book.
Sure. I'll actually just respond a little bit to what you were bringing up, which is very provocative as well. This idea of evil or villainy. And I kind of start off my book posing this question as well, right? Because in the introduction, I just, part of the thing, one of the things I bring up is that, you know, we were supposed to have defeated the Nazis, but then you look at NATO, and for 16 years straight, you had a former Nazi in control of the Central Eastern Command of NATO. Like every single person was a former Nazi, and that should really tell us something about the kind of lies that we've been told in terms of what were supposed to be the priorities, right? The Cold War, which was a very difficult time for like the entire world. Like it justified assassinations, it justified coups. And as I go over in my book too, you had Gladio, which were secret armies, the stay-behind armies that Churchill had set up as part of Operation Unthinkable, which there were two scenarios with Operation Unthinkable. One was after the end of the war to actually attack the Soviet Union. And the other one was to defend Western Europe in case of a Soviet Union attack, which the Soviet Union never did. And they used these stay-behind armies to actually commit terrorist acts against the people living in those countries and to assassinate leaders, including presidents of countries. And I go through this in detail. Daniel Ganser actually did a really great book called NATO's Secret Armies, who goes through this in depth. And it's basically acknowledged now that that was happening. The thing is that it's not in the past, right? Like when these things get exposed, there should be no reason, or with the Frank Church Senate Committee exposing that this what the CIA had been doing, which
That was
wasn't.
in the church committee was in 1976 when it was asked, do you manipulate the media, the press, everything? And they said, yes.
Yeah,
Let's go
but
into
they
closed
also they
doors.
yeah, and they also acknowledge, because with Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA for pretty much most of Eisenhower's, no, actually, yeah, all of Eisenhower's administration, and he was fired by JFK for the Bay of Pigs treason, which again I go through in detail in the book, that story. But he was working with Nazis. And he's the one who, set forward the MK Ultra program as well. But it was also him and Frank Wisner who set up the OPC, the Office for I'm starting to forget, OPC, Office of Projects. I can't remember the acronym now, but basically that was the Gladio arm in the United States, and they were in charge of the secret armies, not just things that were happening within the United States under McCarthyism and later on with a COINTELPRO type stuff, but in Europe too. They had a direct hand in a lot of this kind of terrorist activity. So yeah, I have so much going on in my head, so it's kind of hard to like know exactly.
I fully understand it, because when I've read your stuff, like so many neurons start going up. The questioning is really important. I also start thinking about the fact that you were looking at Ukraine. I start looking at the current deputy prime minister of our country, and the reports I've read about her are a little scary. And I like to say that people are not influenced by their family. However, her maternal grandfather was a nasty, nasty, evil man who came to Canada. You mentioned NATO. A really good friend of mine who I'm interviewing soon, he ran for Orleans in Ottawa. He also ran against Justin Trudeau for the leadership. They took him out. They overrode democracy because he was selected for his writing, and they put in General Leslie. Who was General Leslie? He was the head of NATO. And what happened after Justin Trudeau was elected? Well, you can see behind me, and you can also see that Canada has become almost like North Korea with the restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can just focus on what you discovered about, was it the Gladio? From what I also interpret, were these not also the left behind networks of the Nazis that Churchill and the CIA, where they left off, and they also kept the heads? And these people should have been in Nuremberg. However, they had great government pensions. Von Braun, he is responsible for like 60, 70,000 prisoners, slave labor dying, and he becomes the head of NASA. Like, these are things that the history we're not told, we need to know. So if we can focus on about those groups and about how it impacts us today and what lessons we can learn.
Yeah, so basically the Gladio, and also to finish my thought on OPC, Frank Wisner and Alan Dulles' OPC, what I remembered now I wanted to make a point of is in the Frank Church Senate Committee, they put it on the public, record that the OPC was instituted to intervene in European elections. And, you know, the Italian election, the first election after the Second World War, was a really big one, because it was clear that the communists who had resisted Mussolini were going to win. And they basically justified all types of interventions, including acts of terrorism, which are called the years of lead. It was like about 20 years in Italy where they had all types of really bad attacks on the people and the leadership. But, you know, it was happening all throughout Europe. And this was a silent takeover, as you mentioned, in Iran as well. Mossadegh, he was a lawyer that was trained in, I think, Switzerland. And he was overthrown. He had won his case at The Hague that, you know, Iran should have its oil to do with what it wanted. Churchill wanted the oil for the British war machine. And they overthrew Mossadegh with the MI6 and CIA in favor of the Shah. And you'll see that, you know, with Gladio, they always intervene for a far right government, you know, fascist leaning government, but they also intervene in favor always for the monarchy. In Greece too, it's a really sad story how the Greeks had succeeded in defeating Mussolini's forces that had come in, and then Nazi Germany came in, and the Greeks were fighting side by side with the British until Churchill announces in 1943, you know what, we're going to actually fight along the side of the fascists now, and we're going to start fighting the communist resistance to the Nazis while the war was still going on. You know, they put back the monarch in place and so forth. And they basically terrorized the people. The United States, the Truman Doctrine from 1947, because this continued on after the Second World War, the Greeks were still fighting. The Americans came in, it was the first country that they invaded and started basically this really terrible ongoing process of the United States going into a whole bunch of other countries, always with like this, you know, justification that we're going in to fight the communists, when really it was to ensure a fascist stronghold. The Americans dumped napalm on the Greek people who were fighting for freedom and liberty. And then finally, you know, Greece was hollowed out and it became a member of NATO, and it became one of the central, you know, strongholds for the Gladio. So a lot of the Gladio activities that ended up, you know, occurring within the Middle East, actually the Turkish, there's a Turkish minister that recently, because there was like some kind of a terrorist attack that happened in Turkey, and he said something that made me think he for sure is referring to Gladio here, where he says, make no mistake, we know who is responsible for this, and that it came out of Athens. And that's basically the old Gladio base that has still been going on. You have like someone like Otto Skorzeny, very major Nazi that basically had a huge hand in organizing Gladio and had a lot to do with the Middle East organizing. So like Egypt's army was actually trained with this. There's a lot of these fascist training groups that like entered the Middle East, and Britain also had a hand in the fanatical terrorist groups that, you know, have around Muslim Brotherhood, and also, you know, what has formed subsequently with ISIS.
You just pointed out something that's really interesting for me. The Muslim Brotherhood. It was formed when Egypt was under British control. And then you have the House of Saud, which it should have been Hussein, because the Hashemites were indigenous to Saudi Arabia, not Jordan. They funded and cut a deal with the Wahhabis, who were such a small sect in Islam, because they were such a wonderful part of Islam. They had gone through a great reformation where they had Sufism and they were peaceful. But the British and the Americans, because of their focus on this religious group, because they were so against the Soviets, it's backfired. And from all my reading, they knew it was going to backfire on us. And before we moved forward with your study, I remember that in 2013, Barack Hussein Obama, he signed a bill that allows much of what was done to the rest of the world after World War II to be perpetrated on its own citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can just look at your focus in the Ukraine and why it's so important for us, let's say in Canada and the United States, to learn from this, because when you start digging, you start seeing what's actually out there. We should be frightened, because much of what the rest of the world has experienced since the end of World War II, it's come to a theater near you. And now it's starting to spill out onto the streets.
Yeah, the situation with Ukraine is a very sad one. It's a very unfortunate one. I did I have a whole chapter on the story, and basically I also started at wanting to know what happened. Part of what was helpful is that in 1998 there has been a lot of records about the Nazis and the Japanese fascists as well that were declassified, which is the largest declassification. I think there's like over 8 million pages that were declassified. And so there were some books that were done on this material. One of them is a U.S. intelligence and the Nazis from the National Archives. And it actually, there's a second book, Hitler's Shadow, that is also with the National Archives. And they actually went over a little bit of this Ukrainian story well before this, was a thing. Actually, not that much more before. I think it was around 2012 that they had written about that section of the declassification. And it showed basically the CIA role in that. But before I go there, I wanted to just say that for the Ukrainian mindset, it's unfortunate because Ukraine hasn't really ever been a country until basically the Soviet Union was dissolved. That's when Ukraine really kind of became a country in 1991. And unfortunately, they were never free when that happened. Both the Soviet Union and Ukraine were basically gutted by the perestroika, which was a Western infiltration of a gutting, basically. And Ukraine was basically beholden to IMF policies, which put it into an incredible amount of debt within a short period of time. Ukraine used to be the breadbasket of Europe, and they had actually a very good industrial base, and that was completely gutted. So Ukraine became a really poor country within a short period of time. And at this point, it is the poorest country. The Ukrainians fought and died for what they thought was going to be a brighter future economically in 2014. But as we see with these policies, they're not benefiting Ukraine at all. And people have to really look at that with a more critical eye. The thing is, with Ukraine, the people have been manipulated since the early 90s. You had all right away formations of basically neo-Nazi groups in 1991, as soon as they had their independence. And there was already an attempt to revise Ukrainian history in the earlier part of the 20th century, because Ukraine has always been a part of an empire, and they have not been treated nicely, especially, the Galicia portion, which is the focus of where a lot of the Nazi sentiment comes from. But they have this idea of the golden age of Kievan Rus, which they share with Russia and the Belarusians, but they have had a warped reading of their history where they feel that they are the only true descendants of this period. And that's why you see the trident that's often paired with Nazi, pro-Nazi groups. And you see it with the Azov battalion, you see it with every single one, basically. And the trident is a symbol from that golden age of Kievan Rus, from Volodymyr the Great, or Vladimir the Great, depending, on your take of things. And they felt that the only way to return back to this golden age was to do an ethnic cleansing. So that's how their warped idea of history was done in a very conscious way. I think it was in the 1920s that this was happening, clearly when already there was a lot that was brewing for this kind of blood and soil sentiment all throughout Europe. It wasn't just Germany that was, for that idea. And so that was brought back pretty much immediately in 1991. And when you have economic disparity, you're always going to be able to radicalize people much more easily, because people are frustrated and they're upset, but they don't know why. And you can sell this type of extremism much more easily with groups that are in that kind of.
Is that what's referred to as mass formation, where people feel like it's they're uncomfortable, and then they latch on to something as soon as the power structure said, this is who's causing all your pain, and then they focus on it? One of the things I want to focus on, because most of my listeners are in Canada, is there's a huge Canadian connection to Ukraine. And I can just share it personally. I knew a number of Russian and Ukrainian refugees or immigrants who came to Canada. They were not wealthy. And then I remember opening up a magazine in Toronto, and someone I went to school with, it showed that he was the youngest Canadian billionaire, and he owned the electrical grid of the Ukraine, and he had traded toasters and ovens and Levi jeans to get that. And it didn't hurt that his ex-father-in-law now was an advisor to Yeltsin. But there were so many people who came back who benefited from the West. And on top of that, I remember reading about Christine Freeland, that she was a Rhodes Scholar, if we could talk about that in a bit. She went over to the Ukraine. The KGB in the Soviet Union were talking about her being nefarious. Her grandfather was third down from Hitler, and I want to emphasize that. And we weren't allowed to go out on the streets to exercise our rights. However, she is holding the equivalent of a Ukrainian Nazi flag right in my home city of Toronto without a mask, and talking about how we have to fight for their rights, while she denied Canadians their rights. And if we could talk about this, because to me, she's a stay behind. And it's also frightening that I like to believe that people are not influenced or should not be judged by their lineage. However, she took up the banner for her maternal family proudly. And she is, I believe, the handler for the current prime minister. And I say this because I'm also friends with his half brother.
Yeah, Chrystia Freeland held up the blood and soil flag. That is also the flag of the UPA, the paramilitary unit of the Bandera, Stepan Bandera, Mykola Lebed grouping, OUN. And she then, had another picture where she was not posing with the flag. And yeah.
Love technology, right? Where they could scrub it.
Yeah, there's a lot of people obviously that were upset. I don't know what she was thinking. But that's pretty much, they don't care. Like, they really do look at us as if like this is the medieval times and we're just like all peasants that you can, run over with your horses, and
You're
it
being
doesn't
too
matter.
polite. They see us as useless eaters
Yes.
that are using they don't need us anymore, and they see us as using their resources.
Yeah, and you could see with how Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau were speaking during, the months of February and March and on, that they were just not willing to listen to any voices. So it didn't matter if 60%, let's say, of Canadian voices were saying, I don't agree with this. They would just say, 98% of Canadians agree with us. Like, it didn't matter. People's bank accounts, were just, their money was taken. People can be thrown in prison there, because anything can happen within an emergency situation, which is basically, Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau showed that they have no problems with a totalitarian way of managing people. But yeah, Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather was involved in the Litvak, and basically was a pro-Nazi. And it's weird because she did this study with her, her uncle, Professor Himka at the University of Alberta, actually bringing up all of these things about how her grandfather was like doing these things that were Nazi supported and affiliated. But then when she's confronted by the media, like National Post or whatnot, she says that it's Russian disinformation and it's all a ploy for, the Russians to remove her from power and everything. And it starts to get really ridiculous at this point, because I mean, it's like this in the United States too, right? Like, whatever is going wrong, you can just say like, oh, it's the Russians who did it. Oh, it's the Chinese who did it. It's clearly not the Russians and the Chinese that are causing this massive problem right now towards this move of totalitarianism. It's something that has been gradually and very focused, destination point for us, which you can again just see with the Gladio networks, which are also responsible for the assassination of Kennedy, by the way. And if you look at the record of United States presidents who've been assassinated, like, the number is incredibly high. But yeah, it's very clear looking at this history in this way that even the Ukraine situation, it's not a surprise. It was a powder keg that they had been, organizing for a very long time. And Mykola Lebed, as I mentioned before, he was part of the OUN that was working with the Nazis. He then was given protection by Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, to live in the United States, but also have free travel to continue radicalizing Ukrainians, especially, but more than that too, in Europe. And the CIA was funding basically a continuation of Mykola Lebed type ideology in Ukraine. So their coloring of their history, of their national identity, what they should feel proud about, and so forth, was very much funded by this CIA branch that was working directly with Mykola Lebed during this period. Or you have, like, in Germany as well, you had Reinhard Gehlen, who was put in charge of the West Germany's surveillance, who was a very high-ranking Nazi. They put him in charge like pretty much right away, right after the war, and he is what has set up the entire infrastructure of intelligence for Germany. Even though the German people were told that they had to, have basically pay the price for being, Nazis, so to speak, which is not not really true. There were a lot of German people who were not for that. But then, as you're punishing the German people, you put in place all of these Nazis all over the place. Like it's clear that it was really about just taking over these areas. So the Ukraine situation was something that has been plotted back since Alan Dulles basically, and they have it in their records that they viewed Ukraine as a Cold War weapon against the Russians. They don't care about the Ukrainian people. It's very clear with the economic policies. It's now the poorest country, and the country was actually under civil war for 8 years. I don't know if a lot of people are aware that you have like ethnic Ukrainians and you have ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine. And so if you have a grouping of neo-Nazis, and it's not like all ethnic Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, but if you have a government that's supporting this and like there isn't, any kind of organized resistance against this in Western Ukraine, you can see how this is a very dangerous thing. They were attacking ethnic Russians who are Ukrainians, thinking that they have no place, in that country. So when these regions were asking for sovereignty and to be able to set up their own republics, it was really bad that the West was like, no, you don't have any right in doing that because you're just going to basically be used by Russia. And it's like, but these people are like, they're going to be wiped out. And there's been a lot of like neo-Nazis in Ukraine who have said over their media, and their media too, it's not freedom of press. They shut down pretty much any media that doesn't support this neo-Nazi outlook. They said that they don't care what happens to the Eastern Ukrainian people, but they want the resources because there's actually a lot of mining resources in Eastern Ukraine. So it's very, very ugly. And it's so sad that the West wasn't aware, for instance, with Crimea too, who voted to return to Russia. The Crimea is cut off from Russia, so they still relied on having their water supply from Ukraine, and they had that water supply, about 80% of it. Reuters even reported on that. 80% of that water supply was being cut off, amongst other things. So the Crimean people were being like, basically they had a bit of a siege type situation going on where they weren't getting like adequate resources to sustain their people, and yet these people still said that they don't want to go back to Ukraine because it's clear Crimea is mostly ethnic Russians. What kind of future can you possibly expect with a fanatical branch that thinks that you need a pure bloodline?
Well, one of the things that I'm taking from this and with your book is the lessons learned after World War II. If you're willing to go and find the information, it's foreshadowing for us today, because they might have focused on the weakest chinks in the necklace to go after first, and that would be Europe and Japan, and basically their economies, their people, their identity. It was in flux. However, whatever happens there will eventually happen to us. A individual that had a huge impact on my thinking was Sir John Glib. In 1976, he had a book that came out that was called The Fate of Empires. And he looked at the totality of human history and empires that, which we have written accounts, and they last about 10 decades. And usually what happens is they fall from within, not from hordes coming from out. And he felt that we needed to understand the totality of human nature. And when we get decadent, and maybe some of our leaders are interbred, they basically look for things that amuse them, and they're looking towards us as being useless eaters. And if we look through our history and the lessons that we'll get, especially by reading both your work, Cynthia, and also Matt's, and the Rising Tide Foundation and your Substacks, is we have to look at those lessons and apply them to our own lives and what's happening in our own regions. So what's happening in Ukraine is happening to me. Just like if I have gangrene on my foot, I might have to have my leg cut off. What happens in the human organism, it impacts all of us. And what I've seen, especially with all these letters that are being put behind names now, is let's go and have divide people and not realize what happens to you happens to me, and the only difference is time. So what lesson do you want people to take from your newest book? And if you could share with us what that lesson is and how we can apply it to our lives, to our democracies, supposedly, to our republics, to our constitutional monarchies.
The lesson of the book is that we need to take responsibility at this point for where we find ourselves. The fact that we are increasingly living in a totalitarian system where civil liberties are not being respected is not because of a foreign entity that's trying to attack our pristine system, but rather that our system itself has been taken over, and it needs to be it needs to return back to the better principles, especially, for Americans, the better American principles. So for instance, one of the things I focus on in the book is that Roosevelt's New Deal was very clearly attacked by all of the fascists. You had J.P. Morgan, who tried to do a military coup and was trying to get General Smedley Butler to go along with this. He also had an assassination attempt before that, all within his first year as president. They clearly knew where he was going. He was the one to set up the Pecora Commission. Glass-Steagall's what was taken down by Clinton, which allowed for the derivatives to really take over the economy, is very much what made the 2008 financial crisis, what made it possible for that sort of thing to happen, where we're increasingly living in a world where the rich can get richer no matter what. But the roots of the American system in the Roosevelt, Lincoln, Hamilton traditions were always against the system of imperialism, and their views on economics reflect that. That's why, Keynes had his own version of a New Deal to try to thwart Roosevelt's New Deal, because it was really a big thing. And when the United States has successfully done this, it was a major powerhouse. And that's the thing too. It's like villainy has to work a lot harder than someone who is situated intelligently in the principles of the good, because we ultimately live in a universe where it functions off of that. So as you said, things that don't function on that tend to collapse internally, because it's just not a sustainable thing. It constantly needs to feed off of something else. But if we are able to return again to this comprehension of what were the principles that really allowed the United States to become a great power, and that was organizing other countries like Germany, Japan, China, Russia, were all being organized by Henry C. Carey economic principles. And that's actually one of the reasons why the First World War had to occur, was to actually disrupt this and cause rifts in partnerships between all of these countries. And that's what they are doing on multiple levels, is to try to divide people into partnerships. And that's why they constantly do this fear mongering of like, you always need to be afraid of this country or that country, just, stick to within your own. These are not good things to isolate ourselves. We have opportunities right now where we can form partnerships to defeat this totalitarianism that actually a large chunk of the world right now has really woken up to exactly what this is. Like I was saying with this Turkish minister who was pointing out the Gladio base in Athens, and that it's like, we know who are responsible for these terrorist acts. Don't tell us it's coming from this other thing. We know it's coming from Anglo-America at this point. But, you know, Britain could not have succeeded if it had not taken over the United States from within. It's actually very similar to what happened in ancient Athens with the Peloponnesian War. It wasn't Persia who was able to defeat Athens. Athens fell from within because it became corrupt from within. But the United States still has its foundations. It still can return to its greater status where it used to be loved throughout the world and not hated. So I would say that Matt's book, my book is really good at going through the tracing back all of the bad and where it comes from, whereas Matt's book is focused on the solutions. Especially if you don't know where to start with the economic solutions, Matt's book, Clash of the Two Americas, is a very useful overview to get someone started in, again, being reintroduced to these things.
Well, Cynthia, I have to commend you because I believe society falls into three categories. One, who just follow whatever they're given and they eat what they're fed without question. The second group, they know there's something wrong, they see it, they still acquiesce. And the third group that changes and revolutionizes everything always through history are the ones who see and do. Every tyranny happens because of the first two groups, those who submit without question, those who submit who might question. It always ends for those people who are citizens and they step forward. And I want to commend you. And the story I love is the story of Cincinnatus. Many people don't know it, but he was a senator in the Republic of Rome. Rome was about to fall. They could not agree. They went to him and asked him to become the dictator. He put down his plow because he had a farm. He took up the sword. He put down the rebellion, and they asked him to remain as dictator, and he said no. He put down the sword and took up the plow. Many of us, yourself, you shared with me that before 2019, you weren't as vocal as you are now because you felt something was wrong. You saw something was wrong. You looked and found what was wrong, and you're doing something by bringing it to people who I hope wake up and do something with it, because knowledge is great, but the application of it, it means nothing. So how can we find your book? And if you can just give the full title, because it is very powerful.
Yeah, it's called The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set: The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. You can find it on Amazon, and we also have other ways for you to get it. If you want to go onto my Substack, Through a Glass Darkly by Cynthia Chung, there is a feature post that will have more information on the book.
That's wonderful. And I'll leave this: read, don't watch YouTube or this and just stop there. If you read, you're able to have engagement with the author. And I just have to ask a question, because I ordered your book, Cynthia. I always need large print and big margins. And I like to have the cheaper paper because I need a highlighter and I have to put my pen marks, and I've got to make my notes. Your book actually will provide that for a nerd like me.
I'm not sure. I've actually ordered the books and I haven't received them yet, so I have no idea what they look like right now.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting down and having this knowledge and having more discussions with you. And I want to leave this with you. I find this fascinating that you covered, but when you started talking about Huxley, and all that, that darkness and how manipulation and how these people were so damaged and how it was intergenerational damage, almost like it was a religion where they would sacrifice their children to these demonic beliefs and also do demonic things to their children. I would love for us to have another call on the occult, because you had my full attention. When I told you that I watched like 24 hours, that was the stuff that got my full attention, because it gave me the why for all this crap, which is the things that we're experiencing. How demonic do these people have to be that they are so disconnected with their humanness, with the fact that they're connected to something more, and there's good and there's evil, and they're not able to distinguish it, or they invert it. And I would ask if we could have that conversation, because you had me at Huxley.
Yeah, sure. That would be great. Planning on doing the volume 2 of the series is going to focus on that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, definitely that's the more popular, the more interesting thing for people, and it's going to be a lot of fun to look into that.
Well, you woke me up to many people that I used to like, or had influences on me, and that goes back to why do I believe what I believe? I had no reason to question. And I applaud both you and Matt. I applaud you, Cynthia, for your writing and bringing this to people's attention, because if you're going to make a change, you have to know where you are and what's come before you. Thank you so much for this. And I look forward to many more conversations. Thanks so much, Cynthia.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And I find this all the time. I sit down with business owners all the time, and they always give me unsolicited advice because they want to share their knowledge, and it's really important.
Here with me is Peter Merrick,
president of MerrickWealth.com.
Peter is an income and capital enhancement consultant,
speaker and author.
He is also a
recognized expert in the world of succession planning.
Over 800 published articles and 3 industry textbooks.
He's a Canadian who joins us today from San Diego, California. Thanks for joining us.
So, Peter Merrick, tell us about you.
Well, I've been in the financial service industry since the end of 1991. I graduated during the recession. The baby boomers were in their positions, so there was no jobs. So the 2 businesses that opened up were the technology field and the financial field. It was the Wild West in both of them. So I had this brilliant idea, and I had a friend of mine, and we started talking, and I said, hey, how difficult would it be for us to get a mutual fund dealer license? Not difficult enough. Thank God for those 10 years, the market just went up. I would sit down and I would take somebody's entire life savings that they spent 15, 20 years accumulating it, this young kid who knew nothing about nothing, and I would go and just invest it, and luckily it went up because the markets were crazy in the 90s. It was a boom time. But in 2004, my life blew up.
I almost went bankrupt, but I was very fortunate because there were very few CFPs at the time, but every university in Canada wanted to offer the CFP program, so I got recruited as a prof. And it was great. I was reading all the textbooks. I would call all the big publishers. And what I came to the conclusion was the succession planning was missing.
One of the issues was there was very little talking beyond the accumulation stage. Like, how do you have a healthy life after you've done that? I also looked at demographics. At the turn of the 20th century, the average life expectancy in the West and North America was 43 years old. And people are dying at 83. No one ever lived to 83.
Well, so I always say that there's two financial plans. There's the financial one that we work on, and there's what you get to do with all your time and that energy once you're done. And with this thing that they've been racing towards, they've hit it. But if they haven't thought about what they're going to do after or how they're going to feel validation for their existence, they just never stop. They just keep going.
Well, it's not anybody's fault, because when people are young, they focus too much on doing, and later on in life, they have to focus on being.
So I wrote my own textbooks because
I thought it was very important to talk about how do you transition from the first half of life, which Carl Jung called it the mourning, where you're accumulating, whether it's your ego, designations, education, houses. The second half is deconstruction, giving wisdom away, giving away my money, giving away my time, leaving a legacy.
So talk to me about that stage. What's the purposeful way or kind of the best practices, ways, or considerations for people to take when transitioning into that stage of life?
Well, one, decide whether or not you want an exit. I find between the ages of 55 and 70, a lot of people feel that I'm just tired doing the same thing that I've always done, and I have the money now. So maybe I should get out when the going is good and pass on my business to someone who's got the energy to navigate it. Number two, who are you going to sell your business to? There's one issue about selling it to a family member or an employee. What happens after you sell it? Things don't go right. A lot of business owners want to sell their business because they just want to wash their hands. But by selling it to someone you know, you're not getting out of your business. The best is to sell to a third-party purchaser. The last one is after they make that transition from being a business owner, building a nest egg for themselves to have choice, they don't know what they're going to do. I've spoken to people who say, I'm going to take up golf. So my question is, do you golf now? I don't golf now. So what makes you think you're going to golf later? I just want to share with you guys a story. There was a gentleman, his name was Bob Hunter. He was quite a celebrity. He started Greenpeace during the height of my blow up. When I was going through business loss, he was bringing me on national television. And you know what he was doing? He was saying, so Peter, don't you do that? And then he would give my phone number and he would give my web address. The reason why I went by merrickwealth.com, because it was almost like a phone number that would run across the television, and I could actually see myself making money off of it. And he was dying. He had prostate cancer. And he turned to me and said, Peter, one day you will be in a position that you'll help someone else. And let me share with you about the legacy. Bob's been dead for 16 years. And I'm sharing you the legacy of Bob Hunter because he made a difference for me. And if I make a difference in anyone else's life, I'm a product of those people who are willing to do things and they had no expectations. And a true mentor is someone who has no expectations that they're going to see the tree blossom. The reason I wrote The King of Main Street is younger people don't know how to find the right mentors, and older people have this need to mentor. It's almost like a biological need because they can see beyond their physical existence. They know that the sun was here before them and it will be after them, and what's going to be left behind that they leave. I would joke, I can't make you money, but I can definitely save you money. What I mean by that is I am a Sherpa. That's someone who would guide someone to help them come down. But I realize the most precious asset they have is not their money. It's their time.
What last piece of advice would you like to give our listeners?
If you have a business, the most important thing to ask yourself is, why did you get into the business? And it's usually not to create a legacy, it's to create the lifestyle that you want. And at that point, ask yourself, what do you want to do during your last days? The last human freedom is to choose one's own beliefs, one's own way. Everything else you can have taken away from you. But what you believe and how you choose to act in the world, that is yours. And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And that is going to give you fulfillment emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. You guys have been wonderful, and I want to thank you, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.